To clarify a few pieces, so we're dealing with the period from 2015, which this contract was first put in place. It was extended in 2018. Under the contract, minor construction works were allowed up to the value of €500,000, but 6 of the works that range from 600,000 to 2.4 million were clearly in excess of that. That's correct, yes?
That is correct. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
And when the contract was originally tendered, it was envisaged that works of in and around €3 million per annum would take place. In other words, about 12 million over the course of the contract, but the figure was actually closer to 10 million per year. In fact, 39.4 million in total.
Correct.
Okay. And then 2019, because of Brexit, but not particularly, there was an additional 7.4 million. So the total was, up until the end of last year, was 46.8 million.
Yeah, I'm sure that figure is correct. It rings true, yes.
Okay,
and what happens is this contract obviously was anticipated for maintenance works in our buildings, actually only in Dublin in the beginning. We're now extending, after the recommendations of the CNAG report are fully in place, which most of them are already, we're extending this mode of working across the country. But it's intended for maintenance, small projects, and it has just proved so effective. And when situations arise, as they do, it's the nature of the OPW, it's what we're there for. When there's an emergency, be it a building emergency that affects the usability of the building, or a government crisis like Brexit that has to be dealt with, we have to find the most cost-effective way to deal with that, and sometimes it has to be done very quickly. So, unfortunately, it was never the intention to use this contract like that, but the mechanisms of the contract are so good and give us such good cost control that it actually was a very good way to look after the interests of the taxpayer in terms of value for money. But unfortunately, as a consequence of that,
so have you
we were
carried
exceeding
out
the procurement.
an analysis in relation to the 4-year initial contract of what it would cost if some or all of the works that were undertaken under this contract were actually undertaken in-house? Has there been a cost-benefit crossover analysis?
I might bring in my colleague, Commissioner McMahon, on that, but we're certainly confident that the works were very good value, particularly when that contract was procured, which is 2014, just coming out of the recession. And in the following years, that was one of the concerns we had, is that construction inflation was going at 100 miles an hour, but we at least had...
In 2013? 14?
It was procured in 2014 and came into effect in 2015, and at that stage the construction industry was in a very bad place, recovering from the recession 2010, and so the prices were very competitive. In the years that followed, construction inflation was running at 7, 8, 9% per year, so the prices were going up. So
some of the basis, I'm sorry for cutting across you, in terms of this approach was as a result, if I'm correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, from a deeper circular issued in 2013. Isn't that correct?
Well, I think I'll bring in my colleague John McMahon here now with the detail there.
Well, just before John comes in, that circular stated that the majority of works are procured via external contractors, as OPW's direct labour force has been significantly reduced and cannot fulfil the role for all property. So it seems to be an acceptance within that essentially the austerity measures and staff reduction measures that have been put in place played a role in terms of the outsourcing of these contracts in the first place. Would that be correct to say? Yeah,
I mean, there's 3 ways to do this type of work. One would be the historic way of a direct labour force, and in the past the OPW would have had a very large direct labour force, but that has wound down now to about 150 people who look after historic buildings, as you say. The 2 alternatives really would be individual procurement under the Public Works contract of individual projects for all these works, particularly over £500,000, versus a framework contract like the measured term.
Okay, so
the contract was correct. It's just that it was used more often than it should have.
Yes, so we've determined that a contract that was envisaged to amount to about €12 million over a course of 4 years actually amounted to closer to 50 million over that period of time. So then we come to more recently, where in October 18 there was a new tender appreciated, and essentially the provisions that the OPD put in place in terms of the guidelines for contracting companies essentially meant that you only had one qualifying tender application or expression of interest?
Well, only two companies applied, but I think it will. I'll bring in John McMahon. He'll be able to give you more detail on that as he's directly involved.
Okay.
Hello, Deputy. I'll answer the last bit first, if I can. The competition in 2018. We advertised pretty much a similar contract to the 2014 contract, with some refinements. We increased the thresholds, the indicative thresholds on the volume of work that could be expected under the contract, and the individual pieces of work that might be done under the contract, from 500,000 to 750 and $1 million. The thresholds, part of the intent on the thresholds at the levels that they were was twofold, really. Was if they were too low, we were concerned that we would attract in possible contractors who really wouldn't have the organisational capacity to operate citywide at 600 different buildings 24/7 every day of the year. And if that was too low, too high, and we would limit the attractiveness of the contract to only the biggest players in the market.
So but what you've done in a sense, again, sorry for cutting across you, what you did was you employed a set of parameters that meant that only one company was in a position to actually qualify for it. And in terms of the tender documentation, you set out an expected value of €5 million per annum, which obviously was in an increase of the 3 million, but was nowhere close to the actual outturn that was actually in place in the years in the term of the previous contract. Why was that figure of €5 million determined?
Well, as I said, Deputy, the intent was to attract suitable contractors to bid for the work. At the time that we went out in 2018, the market was, to use a term, flying. The very many contractors had more work on their order books than they could actually handle. So unfortunately, it was more. I would interpret to do with the timing of the advertisement of the contract, which was at the expiration of the previous contract. That is for those reasons that we got a disappointing return. I don't think it was anything to do with.
How is it possible? I'm sorry, I know there's a difficulty with when we're crossing over the connection, but maybe I'll ask Mr. Buckley this: how is it possible to determine that a contract tender is good value for money when there's essentially nothing to compare it to? So when you only have one contract tender, do you accept that there were failings in terms of that process, in terms of, first of all, that the value of what the tender was likely to be in terms of outturn was wrong by about 50%, we can assume, but also that once you had a situation where only one applicant suited the criteria, do you not think it would have been better at that stage to look at perhaps creating subdivisions in terms of that contract? And considering in your own opening remarks you acknowledged that the company themselves subcontract a significant portion of this amount this work anyway.
Deputy, can I possibly answer that question?
Yes, of course.
I omitted to say that in the contract construction, we engage what's called a contract administrator. That's an independent external firm of quantity surveyors, and it's their role. They're contracted to do the due diligence on the tender prices and the tender rates that are submitted by the various contractors. We would hope there would have been more. There weren't, but they did the due diligence on the tender prices that were submitted. The 3,000 individual items in the contract. It's a very, very complicated project. Our contract is a very extensive contract and comprehensive one. So they do due diligence on the 3,000 individual items in that, and on the basis of their independent analysis, recommend or not, as the case may be, the acceptance of the contract. So that firm, at the time of when the current contract was tendered, before that contract was placed, they did their full due diligence on the individual elements of that contract. And it took quite a while of toing and froing with the contractor and the QS firm to get the thing right, but it was done. But we're satisfied, Deputy, that absolutely the best value of money was obtained at the time. And one of the big benefits of the measure time maintenance contract.
My time is up there. I apologise. Perhaps you could send us some further written clarification. But can I just say, Chairman, I find it impossible to understand a context where you have one tender that that you can be in a position to actually assess the value for money. And I understand that things happen and we can do things differently, but we have a problem when we have these type of figures and we have an organisation that doesn't accept that there's lessons to be learned.